Well, thank you very much, Jacob, and thanks for the invitation to speak to your group. As someone who's not an industry sector person, I'm having a great learning curve right now, learning a great deal about various aspects of your sector. And just since we're sharing temperature stories, I happen to be at my cottage about 3 hours northeast of Toronto area right now, and it was 40 below this morning. And 40 below is the place where both Fahrenheit and Celsius meet, as you may recall. So I was very, very grateful for reliable, affordable energy this morning. Yes, I'm speaking on behalf of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. We're a fairly young group as an organization. We've been around for about 4 years now, and we represent small and medium-sized manufacturers and other businesses across Canada. We have a fairly big base in Ontario and membership elsewhere in the country too. And so we're basically a key part of your customer base. Our members are extremely alarmed with developments in the energy sector and how they're affecting the economy in general, that we see reliable, affordable fossil fuel energy sources being disadvantaged in various ways, increasing the price quite dramatically for a number of different reasons, partly market-based, partly policy-based. All the additions, a couple of other speakers have mentioned the regulatory burden that just seems to get bigger and more expensive to deal with for all businesses in every sector of the economy, and overall the reduction in the competitiveness of businesses in Canada. And of course, again, policies are driving some of these trends. Some of them are more market-based and pandemic-related and so on. We also see the oil and gas sector being vilified by a number of our politicians in Ottawa and elsewhere, as are regions of Canada, notably Alberta and Saskatchewan, whose economies are more reliant on the energy sector than other parts of the country. And, you know, some of these stats sort of came out a little bit earlier from some of the other speakers, but you know, our energy, our oil and gas industry represents about 10% of Canadian gross domestic product, about 20% of our exports, pays about 10 to 20 billion, depending on the year, every year into the tax base, employs about 500,000 people. And to think you can phase out or downsize or whatever, that kind of contribution to your economy easily is clearly foolish. I heard some stats recently that the value generated per hour worked by the energy sector in terms of GDP is about $350. The value generated by the equivalent government employee is $50. In Canada right now, we're growing the $50 gang and we're shrinking the $350 gang. Not really a sensible policy for success. And again, as some other speakers have alluded to, our Canadian industry is a world leader in energy innovation and technology, and we should be leveraging that much more effectively. And I know this is happening to some degree, but that should be something we're focusing on leveraging worldwide. And some Canadians, it's interesting, I'm based in Ontario, and it's interesting to see that, you know, there's quite a few Canadians who believe that policies that hurt the energy sector are only a problem for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and those provinces. But what they don't realize, of course, is the heavy reliance on the oil and gas for businesses of all sizes, and the jobs, the high quality jobs that they provide is a major issue right across Canada. And the small and medium sized business community in particular is heavily dependent on the sector. When we see other business groups, and this was part of the reason behind the creation of the coalition in the first place, was we see an awful lot of business groups going along with these government policies, and they're harmful. They're actually harmful policies to their members. And then when you scratch the surface, you find an awful lot of these groups are either receiving money from government, getting preferential legislation, or some other kind of treatment that basically, you know, hamstrings their ability to truly represent the damage that's being done by these problematic policies. They simply don't want to rock the boat. And it's also becoming clear, I think, that a lot of the climate alarmism that's driving some of these policies is frequently based on information that isn't true. It's not factual. theoretical models that have been around for decades and have never been successful at accurately predicting what's going to be happening down the road, and an awful lot of false promises as well about many supposed benefits of going green that never end up materializing. The increasing use of things like the very subjective and inconsistent ESG scoring approach, for example, is a growing concern given its impact on financing markets. We have a whole new vocabulary, of course, these days. We have the Great Reset. We have Build Back Better, modern monetary theory, net zero, ESG, energy poverty. I'm sure you're all familiar with those, and a lot of other relatively new words. And my background is as an economist, and I was especially intrigued by so-called modern monetary theory, which basically the fundamentals of it, you may be aware, basically says that governments can basically spend as much as they want, and they will not stoke inflation. Well, in recent months, of course, we've seen how spending and other factors have been driving inflation. So we don't seem to hear an awful lot about modern monetary theory these days, and justifiably so. I think it's also worth mentioning that all of these policies that are influencing all businesses in Canada, and notably the energy sector, aren't just affecting things from an economic standpoint, but also geopolitics. And when we look at, say, Russia's current belligerence and what's going on with the Ukraine right now, such a horribly disturbing trend that seems to be going on over there, that has been bolstered by the fact that Europe has increased its dependence on Russian gas by eliminating some of its own nuclear capacity and some of its own fossil fuel energy sources. Things like China's Belt and Road Initiative is buying up valuable mining and other resource assets worldwide. And that will presumably increase the developed world's reliance on the supplies of these vital materials. As we saw in Glasgow at the COP26 Climate Summit a few months ago there, these dangerous regimes like China and Russia have no intention of inflicting on themselves the kind of policies that the Western world is pursuing that weaken their economies and also weaken their democracies. So what do we see that needs to be done? Well, what we feel is we need to counter the Great Reset with the Great Pushback. And thankfully, the pushback has become and will hopefully build momentum in the coming months and years. We're seeing a lot of experts, climate scientists and so on, who were originally on the climate bandwagon, but have realized that it's going in the wrong direction, that the policies are much too draconian, possibly unachievable. Some of these net zero policies in the next decade or so, frankly, an awful lot of experts that have a lot more scientific background than I do, don't believe they're achievable at all without carnage in the economy and people's living standards and so on. Some of the people, I just mentioned a few. Michael Schellenberg in the US, he was a former advisor to the International Panel on Climate Change. Stephen Koonin, who was an advisor to Barack Obama on climate issues. Bjorn Lomborg in Europe. Here in Canada, we have Patrick Moore, who was a co-founder of Greenpeace. And he's a vocal critic right now of a lot of these climate policies, that he doesn't believe the objectives will be achieved. And in the interim, it will inflict an awful lot of pain on a lot of people, businesses, and the economy. And these people acknowledge the reality of climate change and the need to do something about it, but they're moderating influences that propose more reasonable ways of dealing with these issues that aren't as punishing to our way of life and our continued need for fossil fuels. Something else we have to do is ensure that the downsides of all these so-called green policies are evaluated and properly communicated, as well as the upsides. We often just hear about the upsides, all the jobs that will be created. Unfortunately, they never materialize, but we hear about all the wonderful upsides, and we never hear about the costly downsides. And again, that's where media is a bit of a challenge, because sometimes I think media feels they should be cheerleaders for this instead of honest brokers reporting the good and the bad with respect to all of these different issues. Another thing that I know that your industry is very engaged with is proposing alternatives that would work better for the environment than even some of our current approaches, be less punitive to businesses and individuals. And I use the example of plastics here. we have a government right now in Ottawa that wants to ban plastics, and they've got all manner of aspects to that. And so far, they're looking at a handful of plastic products, so-called single-use plastic products. But the industry has put forward much more sensible recycling proposals for plastics that are doable, good for the environment, and impose and the notion of phasing out plastics is ludicrous, given plastics are integral in so many of our, and we've certainly seen during the pandemic how essential they are in the medical community. But again, there's alternatives to what the federal government is doing here that are much more sensible and yet still achieve good environmental outcomes. Something else we need to do is bring back manufacturing to North America, oppose the kinds of policies that discourage new resource, new pipelines, and other industrial projects. And I heard recently an expression that this so-called no new development approach, it's kind of a more drastic NIMBY type of thing. I heard someone refer to it as the banana policy. And what they meant by that was build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And I think sometimes there's constituencies that would like to see that happening, but naturally that's pretty foolish and unproductive. We also need to promote a return to freer markets and the productive businesses that contribute to the bottom line, ones that aren't dependent on government, aren't dependent on subsidies or preferential legal treatment. Those are the businesses that truly create the jobs, provide the tax dollars that underwrite our social services, and we also need to reverse the big government, crony capitalist, anti-free market approach that seems to have crept into a lot of our government thinking and policies of late. There was a great article in the National Post just this past Wednesday, a couple of days ago, by Jordan Peterson. And he, of course, is that controversial, interesting academic who has sort of discussed and debated against the woke approach to the universe, which includes some of the issues that we're discussing here today. And he has recently apparently resigned as a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. And I'd just like to read this quote. I thought it was kind of relevant. His topic was basically how the diversity, inclusivity, equity priorities at the university, and presumably most universities these days, are supplanting the seeking of excellent research, quality work, and so on. And he, of course, thinks this is ludicrous. Not that one shouldn't try to achieve the diversity, inclusivity, et cetera, but that they should not supplant the fundamental purpose of education, of higher education, and doing quality work, and so on. So what he says here is, and if you think diversity, inclusivity, equity is bad, wait until you get a load of environmental, social, and governance, of course, the ESG scores. Purporting to assess corporate moral responsibility, these scores, which can dramatically affect an enterprise's financial viability, are nothing less than the equivalent of China's damnable social credit system applied to the entrepreneurial and financial world. CEOs, what in the world is wrong with you? Can't you see that the ideologues who push such appalling nonsense are driven by an agenda that is not only absolutely antithetical to your free market enterprise, but precisely targeted at the freedoms that made your success possible? Can't you see that by going along, just as the professors are doing at his university, that you are generating a veritable fifth column within your businesses? Are you really so blind, cowed, and cowardly with all your so-called privilege? Well, that's he never minces words, and that's a very good example of it. Just to close, throughout history, we've seen the pendulum of ideas and related policies swing back and forth between different ideologies and different approaches. Back in the 1980s, we saw the beginning of a period that favored free enterprise. Leaders like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Brian Mulroney here in Canada, promoting more open trading arrangements, freer markets, less intrusive governments, and the result was dramatic reductions in global poverty and rising standard of living. In recent years, we've seen the pendulum swing back toward a more leftist perspective, a renewed support for big government, and even socialism, without the understanding of history and the many horrors that socialism has created over time. The pandemic, of course, has exacerbated this trend by increasing dependence on government during the crisis. It's now time for the pendulum to swing back toward policies based on facts, common sense, personal freedom, and a maximization of the welfare of the majority of people, not just the elite. We at the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada will be fighting to achieve this pendulum swing, and we hope you will too. The great pushback is started, but it needs more momentum. It'll always be easier to go along to get along, but in my many years of advocating for small and medium-sized businesses with governments, financial institutions, and others, I have always found that if you're nice to the cannibals, they might eat you last. Thanks very much, and I welcome any questions or comments you may have.
Catherine, you talked about your membership and their concerns. I'm wondering how do they see the opportunity going forward, and are they looking at new investment in the country? Are they looking at leaving the country? What do they see as their prospects given the state of the current energy conversation, and what does that mean for small and medium business in Canada going forward?
Well, of course, we can't forget the impact of the pandemic as well, because naturally all of this has come together in a big stew of negatives, really, which is highly unfortunate. And the fact that some of our politicians viewed the pandemic as a wonderful opportunity to sort of get these policies advanced when maybe others weren't looking quite as closely was pretty worrisome as well. But frankly, Tim, it's very, very problematic. A number of our members have already moved operations south of the border or elsewhere in the world because the competitive environment in Canada was so bad. Is not just in the energy, that wasn't just in the energy area, but cost of energy was a key factor. If you're in Ontario, we know you have, horrendous electricity costs, which have been helped a little bit by the current government, but they still prevail. So and this is not something anybody wants to do. It's a last resort to keep their businesses viable, to have to do something that dramatic. And often they'll keep a small operation in Canada because they live here, often for personal reasons. But I think if we don't smarten up, we're going to lose even more manufacturers and other businesses, whether small or even a large, even a medium-sized company. And there's a lot of things driving this: tax policy, regulatory policy, energy costs, and so on. And it is a big worry for Canada. We also know our foreign investment numbers are dropping. If we take residential, if we take residential housing out of the mix, we have seen declining foreign investment in Canada. So we have Canadians leaving and foreign investment declining. Not a very good combination.
Thanks.
Questions from other panelists? Well, a question, if I might ask, you don't mind, is that, I often like to, when speaking to external audiences, mention that in the Canadian context, there is no major political party that denies climate change. Everyone accepts that it's a man-made issue that mankind must address and must confront. What's the position of your members on the need to reduce emissions in Canada and what role we should play?
Well, you're absolutely right. I don't think anyone sane, denies that we have to deal with this challenge. But I think, however, we're questioning how we get there. And like I mentioned the example of plastics. Instead of banning, instead of a rather dramatic thing of banning certain plastics, and you can say, okay, you can ban plastic cutlery, or what I mean. You can ban things that we don't really need, that we really can replace. But what you end up getting into is things that cannot be replaced by something else sensible. They have to be some type of plastic, and food wrap is a good example. And again, the medical example is a great one, because so much sanitary grade materials are absolutely essential. So I just think it's a matter of how we get there, and trying to get away from ideologies and get into actually measurable goals. One of the criticisms that a lot of our members have is governments announce these policies, they never measure them, they have never been honest. The federal government has never been honest on the impact of the carbon tax, Other entities have had to try with imperfect information because the government is not forthcoming with the information. Other entities have tried to guesstimate, okay, what are we seeing in terms of emissions and so on, that you can attribute to the carbon tax. So I think it's a question of how we get there. And unfortunately, the polarization of the debate doesn't help, because often it's portrayed as you're either all in with these extremely draconian policies in many regards that are having a terrible effect on average people. They don't affect the politicians, of course, so they're okay. But we don't. But and if you're not in favor of that, well, then you're a denier, or some such pejorative term. Whereas I think most sensible people, and this would include the members of our organization, are somewhere in the middle. Want to do something that's measured, tangible, and effective, and that doesn't beggar people and drastically harm our competitiveness in the process.
Excellent. So there's a question from the audience that I thought I'd elevate to the entire panel, and it's what pivotal strategies are required to achieve greater integration and resiliency across Canada's diverse energy delivery system. Saying, is this something the Energy Council of Canada could look into? Possibly, but do people want to speak a little bit about how we integrate together and how we leverage each other to meet the challenges that Catherine's talking about?
Hey, Jacob, it's Bob here. I would just say Tim has done a really good job bringing the entire energy value chain together for regular dialogue with key officials in Ottawa, senior officials, and trying to make the case that the industry is speaking with one clear voice. And that's very helpful, and that's one area where we're collaborating and making sure the energy message from coast to coast and up and down the value chain is being heard as forcefully as possible. So kudos to Tim for that.
Jake, it's Tim. I'll just weigh in. Slight correction of Bob's point. That's the full value chain of the hydrocarbon energy mix. There's a parallel conversation happening, I know, on the electric side that Francis and John and others have been in. I know about that because I was part of it for a while, because as Francis noted, we've got a fair bit of overlap between electric and natural gas industries, particularly downstream, when you've got companies owning assets of both kinds. I think there are lots of conversations going on right now between various players in the energy sector, and that's healthy. You want to have more conversations between all of them, but I think you also want to be encouraging competition between all of them, because out of competition comes ultimately a better offering for the customer, right? The way to drive energy affordability and reliability and environmental performance is by ensuring that all players in the energy sector have an opportunity to compete with one another and deliver on what's desired. That's why it's so problematic when governments talk about bans, when governments talk about eliminating something or choosing some particular technology or option over another. You don't want government to do that. Government's not good at picking winners. What you want is for government to lay the groundwork so that all of us as industry players can work together, can compete with one another, and can deliver ultimately what consumers want.
Jacob, the only thing I jump in and add is that, a lot of the dialogues that, Tim and Bob were mentioning are about creating the policy environment that allows these things to happen, that incentivizes leadership, that allows those winners that, maybe someone wouldn't have picked to emerge. And I think, even while we work together and also compete in a healthy way to create the solutions Canadians need, I think there's a lot of shared ground around the kind of policy space we can have, and really showing the kind of wins that can come from that right space for all of these different sources of energy is something we can work together to advance.
Agreed. I mean, I often like to take a step back and think about us Canadians on the global scene. I mean, we are involved in absolutely every different kind of energy that there is out there, and we're leaders and we're big players in it. We're diverse. We cooperate and we compete. I'm always mindful of the fact that each of you on this screen here are each other's customers in the Canadian context. And some days you may be competing hard, and other days you're cooperating. and it's actually us Canadians that benefit from that kinetic activity between all of you. So I often say that when I watch sports, I root for the referee. I'm in favor of the contest, and I want to make sure that all of our players are strong on that field, and we do benefit from that. And so it's just a nice point midway here to kind of check in on that.